Good day and welcome. I'm Joey, and this is Orange D20. Today, I want to talk a little bit about running a legacy game for your tabletop RPG. My brother called these generational games, but I want to expand a bit on the concept because the characters are not always just the next generation. Sometimes they're just the legacy of the game that ran before. So last week, we talked a bit about ending a campaign and the big elements and planning what to do to have that all come together. The protagonists either overcome the odds or are defeated by their greatest foe. Either way, those characters' greatest story has been told, and it's time to retire those characters. Your players will have been invested in these characters. They've played them for a while, the characters have had an impact on the world, and it is a sad thing to set them aside. So I like to go back to the world that those characters lived in and see how they've changed it. I really don't want to do this the week after the last campaign ended, either in the real world or in the campaign. In the real world, I want to take a break and have a little space from that last story arc. I asked the players, now that you have vanquished the avatar of Wolf, what does your character do? Most players have thought about this. They've picked out their retirement spot, or they have a kingdom they want to run now that there's peace, a cathedral and a flock to administer to, or a cheap bar on the edge of nowhere they want to run. I always consider this to be what the characters intend to do and put them on pause with what that next goal is, but we won't be touching that campaign for a while. In the real world, I tend to run a lot of different systems. I often like to switch games after a campaign. So if we've just played characters from level 1 to level 20 in D&D, I might try and talk my players into trying something very different, like Star Wars Edge of the Empire or Savage Worlds Rifts. We've just spent a year playing a fantasy game, so let's play something with lasers and spaceships and mechs for a while. The rules and the stories each system is good at running are very different, so it clears the mind and it opens up some narrative space. If you're a newer dungeon master or game master, you may not be comfortable running in multiple systems. I would still find a way to take a break from what you just did. Maybe you spend some time in a different campaign setting. Maybe you take this chance to play evil characters. Maybe you change the tone of the game, play it sillier, or play a more horror-inspired game than last time. But there are a lot of great games out there, and I would recommend learning more than one system. What you learn from playing another game will make your main game better. I also want the last campaign game to fade into memory a little bit. I know I'm not going to remember every location, every NPC, or even all the big events that happened. My players won't either. But I want it all to become a bit more fuzzy before we go back to that world. I want what happened in our last game to be more of a history, not what happened to you and your friends last week. When time starts getting close to go back to the original game, I start thinking about what the plot of the next game will be. I'll decide if there's some loose thread or some villain that got away that would be a good problem for the next generation of heroes to confront. Or in the case where the last campaign ended in defeat, I start thinking about what the villains have done. When time starts getting close to go back to the original game, I start thinking about what the plot of the next game will be. I'll decide if there's some loose thread or some villain that got away that would be a good problem for the next generation of heroes to confront. Or in the case where the last campaign ended in defeat, I start thinking about what the villains have done. The players now get to be the rebels against this terrible force that managed to defeat the greatest heroes of the last generation, and they have a world that really needs them. In a successful game, sometimes there isn't a loose end worth making a whole new campaign out of. That's okay. You just use the same world and how it's changed as the background to an entirely new story you're telling. The heroes of the past are now previous PCs, and players love that, even if what they're doing has nothing to do with what the last generation of heroes did. Next, I start deciding how much time has passed. I usually make sure it's far enough into the future that the PCs of the last game aren't going to be up to do much. This can be a little harder in a fantasy game where elves live for a millennia. The shorter-lived PCs, if they're still alive in the next game, are often too old to handle a long string of adventures themselves. Sure, they might be good for 1 or 2 fights, but if they deal with any serious threat, they're going to be taken out pretty quickly, or choose to step aside and let the new heroes take their place. While the easiest solution to this problem is to go far enough into the future that all the past PCs are dead, perhaps very long dead, I actually tend to prefer to have some or all of them alive, but generally inactive. Then I start thinking about how the world has changed. I generally keep notes in my binder about each location, each city, each country, and some of the major dungeons that aren't just some goblins got in the mine, but this is an ancient and sacred labyrinth that constantly has something living inside it. I don't do every location in my world as soon as I'm planning a new game. I start it out like I would any other game. I figure out where the game starts and I start building around there. If you're starting in a town the characters have been in before, I figure out what's changed. If it is a brand new location, I figure out where it is in relation to at least one of the legacy locations. If I'm using a legacy place as the starting location, I let them know basically the history of the last 20 years, because for most characters, that's their entire life. For players who played in the previous game, they're also paying attention to the older history, and they're probably going to be playing characters who have some tie further back. It just becomes general world knowledge that they can throw out there without having to make a history roll first. If we're playing in a brand new location, I'll say, oh, you guys are playing in such and such city, which is 300 miles south of the imperial capital, giving it some relation to the previous game to help them place it. Next, I let the players know that this is going to be a legacy game. They have the option to carry on the legacy of a PC from one of the previous games. This could be the child of one of the previous characters, or their apprentice, or someone who reminds the world of that previous hero. Hey, that guy's like a whole new Robin Hood. I always make this optional. Some players will want a brand new character who isn't related to the past games. Some may want a secret connection, like the secret child of one of those previous characters who doesn't know who their famous parent is. One thing I'll often do in a legacy game is ask the players to play someone else's legacy. So you can't be your own last character's legacy. You can be the apprentice of someone else at the table's great wizard, or the child of one of the other player characters' world-famous fighters. I have run a lot of legacy games in Legend of the Five Rings. We started in this book, and then we had to transfer to this book, and then we ended up transferring into this book. We played more than one campaign in each of those rule sets. Legend of the Five Rings is really great for this because character history, teacher legacy, family legacy all have a huge impact in the setting of the game, so it lends itself heavily to being a generational game. The famous heroes in the past of your family, or your family's dark secret, or being the student of a great teacher have a huge effect on how the world treats you. So it is a game that is primed for legacy. In the original campaign, two of the players had been playing rivals, constantly seeking to outdo each other for the glory of their clans. In the second game, each played the other's daughter. They decided that the two daughters had grown up knowing each other, meeting at their father's various competitions for duels, and had actually become very close friends. It was interesting because when we talked about either father, both of them had an external view. If the same player is now playing the child of their last character, that child perfectly understands the parent. They know what they were thinking, why they made the choices they did. The child basically has a perfect understanding of the father. If a new player plays the child, then there's an outsider's view, and sometimes they have questions over, why did dad make that choice? There's an outsider's view, and it makes the relationship more complex. One of the fascinating things about playing in this style is the players already have a shared knowledge of the world that bleeds into the characters. They know who the greatest heroes of the last generation were and who those villains were. A favorite magic item can become a beloved family heirloom, and it starts to mean more than just being a +2 sword. Meeting someone from the last campaign becomes more exciting because it's like meeting someone famous who you have heard stories of growing up, and the players are always fascinated to learn how these NPCs have changed since they last saw them. One thing I would always caution is not letting history overwhelm the present. This is a lot like my episode on backstories, because the previous games have become backstories. Just like the PCs of the last game can't solve all the problems for the new characters, you also don't want to spend the whole game as, hey, look at this thing you remember. If you're just watching a memory of those memories, you don't really have a real story or a real game anymore. Sure, you want elements of the past to show up, but they should be exciting, and any element you bring forward from the last game needs to fit into the new game. When this works well, a hated enemy from a previous game is a great cameo. This can become an ongoing animosity with a historical rival, or my favorite is when a long-lived villain returns, and the players are already afraid of them, because the characters have heard stories about these monsters for years, and the players know that they might not be ready to beat them. They could barely beat them last time they faced them with more powerful characters. You don't want to try and drop in a villain from the past who's supposed to be terrifying and have the players think, oh no, not this guy again. Or sometimes even worse, wait, who was that? If an element of a previous game comes up, you want it to enhance the experience for anyone who remembers the previous game. You also want it to fit into the new game. If someone wasn't there for the last campaign, it shouldn't require any more explanation than it would if you introduced a completely new element. Going back to my L5R Legacy games, I introduced an old evil warlord named Daigatsu Jin into the third Legacy game. We had new players, and all they knew was an evil, tainted warlord had shown up, not much different from their other enemies. Eventually, one of the new players found the shrine of a Crab Clan hero, Hideoki, and was blessed by him with the power to stop Jin, receiving a magical weapon that terrified the old demonic warlord. For players who had played in that first game, all of them were very excited about this. They remembered when they met a young man, Kitsune Jin, who turned out to have made deals with dark forces, and one of the characters, Hideoki, had died protecting the rest of the group from this monster. When these two returned, spiritually empowered 50 years later, it was enhanced for the players who 5 years earlier in real time had played the first game, but it was still a full and compelling story to the players who hadn't been part of that earlier game. That's always your goal with these legacy games. The stories you tell should stand on their own. They don't need all the history of the previous game to make them enjoyable, but if you did remember that previous game, there's a little bit of extra in there for you, and everything ends up being more complete because you're not just sitting in a vacuum thinking, what should my world be like? You actually built it out with your players once, and now you've got a fuller history to draw on. So today what we looked at was using your past games as backdrops for your future campaigns. You want to make sure you have a little distance from the last time you played, both in the real world and in the game, so that things change and you're not just going back right away. You want to plan around how your world has changed. Let players choose if they want a direct legacy from the last game, and maybe encourage them to mix it up amongst themselves, not playing their own legacies if you can talk them into it. That can be a really hard discussion sometimes. Make sure that anything you bring forward works both on its own and as part of the legacy. So thanks for watching, and if you really like this, maybe like the video or subscribe to see new ones as they come out. Thanks. Bye.